Welcome to the HEV Mark IV.
Down the hallway, there's the pulpy sound of a crowbar ka-thunking into the soft as peach outer layer of skin on some organic lime-green colored creature. To the left, one hears the rat-a-tat-like resonance of a machine gun spewing bullets, followed by the tings of scores of empty shell casings hitting the ground. To the right, there's silence. Almost. It's a quiet room, the silence broken only by the hollow cadence of fingers furiously tapping away on a keyboard. A window provides a beautiful view of the Lake Washington, a stark contrast to the rest of the room littered with hundreds of pieces of computer hardware, multiple monitors, a whiteboard, and more than a few Diet Coke cans. One of the monitors is alive with lines of code, the technical language that makes a computer game run. There are no ka-thunks or rat-a-tats in this room. Not everyone at Valve Software is playing a last-minute game of Half-Life, the highly anticipated first-person action game published by Sierra Studios. In this room, someone's still working away, and rightfully so. The game's not finished yet, but it's almost done. Almost. It's finally sinking in that 2 years of work is being taken away, sighs John Guthrie, a young and affable game designer at Kirkland, Washington-based Valve. This week, his colleagues have started calling him Neckbeard, referring to the fact that he hasn't shaved in days. Today, his priorities lie elsewhere. I keep watching the clock as I play Half-Life again and again, knowing at some point someone's going to say it's time to stop. Guthrie's been working on the game for 2 years, and as of late, that's meant 18-hour days with no weekends. He hasn't had time to sleep, much less shave. The brown doormat outside his office says it all in big black letters. Go away. Although other employees don't spell it out so clearly, just about everyone at Valve feels the same way. The minute hand on Guthrie's desk clock sweeps up to the top of the hour on this Monday afternoon. He glances at the clock, mentally noting that another hour has come and gone. But now, it's 4 o'clock, and everyone at Valve knows what that means. The ingeniously termed 4 o'clock meeting. But the meeting is more important than the name suggests, especially today. From his office at one end of the building, Valve co-founder Gabe Newell, wearing a maroon button-up golf shirt and khakis, gets up out of his plush black leather chair, opens his door, and begins to walk down the hallway. He hears the sounds of gunfire, screams, and growling monsters, too. It's what he wants to hear. As he proceeds down the hallway past the 8-foot-high red mahogany doors of all the developers, he doesn't need to say anything. He's like a shepherd subconsciously herding his sheep with an imaginary staff. Then, halfway down the hall, he finally announces the obvious. It's time, he says. Everyone follows him in lemming-like fashion to the main conference room. The 4 o'clock meeting is about to begin. While walking down the hall, Newell provides an update on the game's progress. Mike Harrington has about 80% of the outstanding work items, he says. Everyone else is just playing through the game time and again, searching for the bugs. They hope they don't find many. Half-Life, already delayed for nearly a year, must be on store shelves for Thanksgiving. Only a matter of days remain to get the game finished. Time is of the essence. That pressure and lack of sleep dictate that Newell keep the meeting short. There's no time for funny anecdotes or long-winded speeches. What's left to do, he asks, twiddling a black pen in his right hand. Then the bad news arrives. A few of the staff have found what they call showstopper bugs, errors in the software that make the game unplayable at certain points. The bugs can be fixed, but no one knows just how long it will take, and there's still one major issue that has yet to be resolved. A problem that causes the game's multiplayer server to run so fast that it can't talk to the player's computer. At the moment, no one knows what's causing the problem, which means it's impossible to fix. As the meeting draws to a close, all the developers look up to an object hanging 2 feet below the ceiling. This sort of dangling carrot is a piñata of a headcrab, a vicious flesh-colored monster in the game. Made out of papier-mâché by Guthrie's girlfriend Jamie, it hangs motionless, silently awaiting its fate. No one knows what's inside. It's a surprise, says Jamie, with a look that says she'll really be happy to have her boyfriend back when this is all finally done. On the desk below the crab, there's a yard-long black crowbar. Newell looks down at it for a second. You can tell he wants to pick it up, swing it, and bust the crab to smithereens. But that's not how things work. The piñata can't be touched until the team goes gold. Industry slang for the moment when a game is finished and sent off to manufacturing. Only then does the crab meet its fate. As the meeting ends, the developers leave the conference area and head back to their offices. They're a ragtag bunch. One used to be a patent lawyer in Atlanta. A couple of them were pizza delivery boys who dropped out of college to join Valve. One was a guardian angel in New York. Then there's the tattoo artist, the Harley-riding, prosthetic limb software-creating genius, and a lead singer in a Seattle rock band called Lucy's Fishing Trip. If you were to try to fit all this bunch into the typical game developer archetype, high school nerds come software geniuses, you'd be dead wrong. They've been through a lot together. The story of Half-Life is a 2-year epic with plenty of twists and turns, and they had to do it all from scratch. As Newell, who along with partner Mike Harrington left a successful career at Microsoft to start Valve, reminds us, within the domain of where Mike and I were coming from at Microsoft, we were pretty damn good with operating systems and Windows. But in our mind, coming into this industry, we had a lot to prove. And prove themselves is exactly what they did. Newell was right. In the gaming world, he and Harrington were unknown commodities. Both were decade-long veterans of Microsoft, helping to manage staple products such as Windows NT, OS2, and Microsoft Bob. It may not have been glamorous, but it was lucrative. Very lucrative. Both Newell and Harrington are part of an elite group dubbed the Microsoft Millionaires, young software developers who all made enormous amounts of money with their Microsoft stock options. Some have gone on to start their own restaurants, others have bought farms in Iowa, but Harrington and Newell wanted to make games. I like developing software, good working environments, and games, explains Harrington, who has a boyish charm and approachable disposition. I put all these elements together and decided that I couldn't just leave Microsoft and do nothing. But Harrington didn't want to start the company on his own. He talked to lots of Microsoft employees about working together in the games market, but most were more interested in doing research than shipping products. Harrington didn't want to burn money on his hobby or toy around with technology forever. He wanted to ship games, and so did Gabe Newell. It was as simple as that. Or so they thought. Mike's wife Monica, a marketing executive at Microsoft at the time, didn't take her husband's plan for a game shop very seriously at first. I remember when Mike first told me that he wanted to start a games company, she recalls. I envisioned him working out of the extra space above her garage. However, she soon realized how serious both Harrington and Newell were about their new venture. I woke up when he told me he and Gabe would be signing a 5-year lease for office space in downtown Kirkland. Office space was only the first of many pieces of the puzzle that would quickly fall into place for the fledgling game studio. With their own pocketbooks funding the company, initial financing wasn't the major issue it often is at other startup developers. Still, important decisions had to be made from the outset. The first was what genre the company wanted to tackle. It didn't take long to decide. 3D action games were our favorite genre, says Newell. We also thought there was a lot of room for improvement. The only problem was that Newell and Harrington didn't know a thing about developing a 3D action game. That's where Michael Abrash, a close friend of Harrington's, comes into the picture. My friend Michael Abrash had recently left Microsoft to go to id Software, says Harrington. He told me that we had to license this new engine he was working on with John Carmack. So, when the invitation came through to visit Abrash in Texas, Harrington and Newell were quickly on the road and on their way to id. In late 1996, Newell and Harrington arrived at id ready to listen and learn from the industry pros. However, as Abrash remembers, the id gang wasn't too thrilled at the prospect. I don't recall that when they came down to id, there was a lot of great chemistry, he says bluntly. Let's put it this way, it wasn't like when 9 Inch Nails came to visit. That was a cool thing. These were guys that worked on stuff like Microsoft Bob and home automation. You're not going to walk into the coolest game company on the face of the earth and have the guys say, "Wow, nice to hang out with you." Indeed, without Abrash's involvement, it's unclear whether Valve could have licensed the Quake engine, but because Abrash was willing to vouch for them, the powers at id agreed to meet and work with Newell and Harrington. It was an important break because the partners viewed the acquisition of the Quake engine as critical to getting their company off the ground. When we sat down and looked at it, the areas that we wanted to be innovative in for first-person action games did not require us to be innovative in the areas where John Carmack had already done a lot of work, says Newell. It would have been too much to go from 0 to 25 people and have a stable team to build an engine at the same time. After picking up some tips and discussing the inner workings of the business, the two developers headed back to Seattle with Quake source code in hand. Except for Abrash, no one at id was sure they'd ever be back. Everyone at id wasn't very optimistic about what Mike and Gabe were going to do, states Abrash. Back in Seattle, Newell signed the papers to set up the company, on his wedding day no less, and it was time to settle on a name for the new venture. Newell was intent on not following the industry standard. We wanted a name that didn't suggest we were about testosterone-gorged muscles and the extreme of anything, he explains. They finally settled on the name Valve. The other name they nearly picked was Hollowbox. The duo was off to a good start. Their hollow box was beginning to fill with ideas, technology, and advice from industry leaders such as id Software. Still, they'd need help to pull this off, and plenty of it. Besides the Quake source code, the most important thing that Newell and Harrington obtained from id was a shopping list of sorts, a list of names of some of the most innovative and exciting developers working with Quake technology. Two of those developers were Steve Bond and John Guthrie, Floridians who had started a popular online fan site called Quake Command. Guthrie was going to college and delivering pizza when he and Bond received an email that would change their lives. "We got this email from a guy named Gabe Newell," recalls Guthrie. "He told us he wanted to talk to us and left his phone number." Both Guthrie and Bond thought the email message was a joke, and they ignored it until curiosity finally got the better of them. Steve eventually called him, says Guthrie. That day, Gabe bought Steve a plane ticket, a rental car, and a hotel room. It all seemed too good to be true. Steve was standing at the airport, waiting for the electronic ticket to come through, and he kept saying, "This has got to be a joke." But it wasn't. Once in Seattle, Bond was given a few days to stay in the city and make a decision that would change the rest of his life. Once Bond decided to join Valve, Guthrie wasn't far behind. A week later, I followed Steve up to Seattle and decided to drop out of school. In case his parents are reading, he's quick to add, "Though I'd like to return to school one day." Harrington can empathize. "Both Gabe and I didn't finish school. We dropped out to do software," he says. "And we firmly believe that if you find a smart, creative person, they can do a great job. It's catching them early that's key. If you're lucky enough to find them early on, you can be around when they grow into themselves. That's the time when they do a lot of really interesting work." But with young guns, growing pains are inevitable, especially since many of their hires had never done professional work before. "We had to help them get grounded in Seattle," admits Harrington. "But it was a lot of fun, creating a positive work environment and some aspect of parenting, too." Harrington and Newell rounded out the development team with other online developers, though they were careful to not hire myopic Quake fans that didn't have a sense of what was next for the genre. They also brought in some industry veterans from companies such as 3D Realms, Shiny, and Microsoft to round out their team, or band as Harrington refers to it. "Until you find the right people, the band just never takes off," he says. They had their technology, their team, and their genre. Now they needed a game, and a publisher to put it on store shelves. With the team in place, the time had come for Valve to find a publishing partner. It had been mostly smooth sailing for them up until this point, but they were about to meet a strong crosswind. It was sort of weird going from Microsoft, where you were really respected, to going into a meeting with a game publisher who said, "Go away, stop bugging me, come back with credibility," remembers Newell. He recalls one meeting in particular that didn't turn out as planned. The presentation was proceeding as normal when it was mentioned that Valve wanted to use a skeletal animation system, animating the characters using digital bones and joints in the game. As soon as they suggested such a concept, the publisher said, "Okay, meeting's over." "They didn't believe we could do it," says Newell with a wide "I told you so" grin. But their luck turned when Newell emailed another Seattle publisher, Sierra Online. Ken Williams, industry legend and Sierra Online founder, received the message. Williams recalls that when he got the email from Newell, "I had been looking aggressively for some product in the Quake genre. I was looking at licensing with one of the 3D shooter engines and was negotiating with id and some others. Fortunately for Valve, it had the advantage of a secured Quake engine license." Williams was intrigued. Gabe said he had the license and a team of ex-Microsoft people put together. It was the right email at the right time. A meeting was set between about 10 Valve staffers and Sierra in November of 1996. On that fateful day, it snowed in Seattle, an extremely rare occurrence that basically shuts the entire city down. But as Harrington says, there was no way we weren't going to show up. "We all get in my 4-wheel drive car, slid around, and finally get to Sierra. The entire office building was vacant, except for the one person who made it into work, Ken Williams." Valve began its pitch and, as Newell recalls, about 20 or 30 minutes into the presentation, when we were just starting to gear up for our big close, Ken says, "Okay, you're done. Let me tell you why you should be working with Sierra rather than anyone else." They'd caught him, hook, line, and sinker. What impressed Williams so much about the Valve team? "Most of the developers I spoke with were groups of artists and designers, but no engineers," he states. Valve were the first ones who were using an existing engine as a starting point, not a finishing point. In addition, by 1996, Sierra had started to feel the pain of not having products in hot genres such as action and real-time strategy. It was time to make a move. "We needed to get into the 3D shooter category," Williams says. "I did like Doom, but I saw it as a one-trick pony. By the time I decided we wanted into the genre, we were too far behind. With 2020 hindsight, I blew it when I had the chance to buy id and didn't." You read that right. Sierra had the opportunity to purchase id Software in the early 90s, but the deal broke down over a couple $100,000 that Sierra didn't want to put up front. But Williams didn't get mad, he got even. "Valve was the first group I had spoken with that could put Sierra in front of id," says Williams. Shortly after the meeting with Valve, Williams left Sierra, and the torch was passed to Scott Lynch, the man who has briskly reinvigorated Sierra under the new label Sierra Studios. "Sierra got a little comfortable in the early 90s, he says. "We turned into a factory instead of a creative colony. We weren't seen as an innovative company. Valve had the potential to change all that." But Lynch did have his concerns. "I think the big question with Valve right from the beginning was, okay, you've got the Quake engine, but is this just going to be new Quake levels? What we all wanted to see was Valve take the technology as a foundation and add something new." When they started talking about telling a story and creating a persistent world, it was pretty obvious that they weren't going to do a mission pack with the Quake engine. Sierra was interested and confident. They signed Valve up for a one-game deal. The game was codenamed Quiver. When Valve started brainstorming about concepts for the game, one of the first ones brought up was a book Newell had read by Stephen King called The Mist. The book talks about this thing that happens at the Arrowhead secret military base, recalls Harrington, and this mist comes out like a big fog bank. Behind the bank is a slew of monsters who ravage a city and trap all these people in a grocery store. Thankfully, the grocery store idea was dropped, but the parameters of King's story intrigued the team. We thought it would be fun to do a scary action game, explains Harrington. What was then called Quiver would go through much development before the team would be satisfied with the story, much less the game. Yet the team didn't want to be too picky. Harrington wanted to ship a product as soon as possible. It was a wise move. For a new company, trying to create a blockbuster game often results in bankruptcy. Valve set out to do a Class B game and not a Class A game, says Abrash. The model for starting a company, and the one I think Gabe and Mike followed, Carmack would tell you this in a second, is to just ship something. As Abrash explains, if a company sets out to do a killer game, it gets stuck behind the curve and ends up being too late with the product, which generally turns out to be a B game or worse anyway. Eventually, the story for Quiver morphed into what we now know as Half-Life, the tale of an MIT grad called Gordon Freeman who works at the Black Mesa Research Facility in Arizona. You're Freeman, an average Joe who has never carried a weapon, let alone killed anyone. However, inside the research facility, things are not as they seem. Shady characters and secret experiments abound. On the fateful day when the game begins, a disaster strikes the facility, and things take off from there. From the outset, Valve was intent on building a game around a story and not vice versa. It wanted to make a dense environment that provided for something new around every corner. Valve wanted living and breathing characters, a plot, puzzles, and a lot of action. For a long time, explains Newell, 3D action games seemed to keep treading down the same path, an increasing focus on a narrow definition of gameplay, and a focus on the rendering instead of the gameplay. Valve was intent on bringing something new to the game's environment apart from snappy graphics. Not everyone thought it was a good idea. We'd occasionally get people who would say things like, "Stories? Who needs them? I just want a rocket launcher that fires faster," says Newell. It's pretty scary to be spending a big chunk of your own money and be going in a direction that's different from the norm. It's a sad commentary on the game industry that Valve was different than the norm just because it wanted to develop a cohesive story to accompany the game's action elements. Michael Abrash says that Valve realized something early on that helped it craft a highly balanced game. For the most part, level designers can't design games, he says. What Valve figured out was that you needed a creative committee to design a game. A level designer worries about things such as how to lay down the bricks, but not necessarily the story and the scope of the game. With that idea in mind, last summer, Valve commissioned novelist Mark Laidlaw, whose award-winning novels include California and the 37th Mandala, to help flesh out the plot and characters. We didn't want the story to rely on one character coming and telling you the whole tale at one point, and that was it, explains Laidlaw. We wanted to gradually ease the player into the story and provide little clues along the way. So, Valve created a cast of characters that would inhabit the game. Einstein-esque scientists who would talk to the player, security guards called Barneys, in homage to Don Knotts' role as the pretentious, lovable fool on the Andy Griffith Show, and of course, the player, Gordon Freeman. In a lot of shooters, cautions Laidlaw, for all you know, you could be a weapon walking around a level. It's pretty clear in Half-Life that's not the case. Of course, all this was still on paper at this point. We weren't even sure it was technically possible to make the characters talk, says Laidlaw. That's when Valve's software engineers came into play, the people who would lift the world of Half-Life from paper to digital reality. Although Valve had the Quake technology, it didn't intend to just build a game on top of it. Valve had a group of engineers that wanted to extend the engine and custom tailor it for the game. Put simply, Valve's vision for Half-Life was beyond the capabilities of the Quake engine, and to make it a reality, major obstacles had to be overcome. For example, due to the limited memory of typical PCs, conventional animation methods simply would not work for the amount of character animation the team wanted to put into the game. That's where Ken Birdwell, a man who John Guthrie calls a genius, comes into the picture. Birdwell, who rides a Harley and used to design software that scanned a person's foot and created custom shoe insoles, was behind the concept of skeletal animation in the game. I wanted to see more fluid animation, but we didn't have enough memory, he explains. We needed to compress down the animation by a factor of 10 to 100. Skeletal animation was the answer. We actually create bones and joints for the characters. As characters walk around the environment, they have a virtual skeleton that creates the movement seen on screen. The skeletal animation system also proved useful in solving the problem of making mouths that move on characters. Newell is particularly proud of this achievement. I remember when Ken and Kelly had been working in secret to get the mouths to move, a really hard technological problem. They kept it quiet because they wanted to impress us all when it was done. It's an amazing feeling to think that something really innovative and cool is going to come out of the guy in the office next to you. To make the mouths of the characters move in-game, Birdwell and Bailey actually created bones in the faces of the characters, which in turn are used to manipulate the movement of their jaws. Guthrie is still dumbfounded by this achievement. If you ever wonder who goes to college when he's 13, it's someone like Ken Birdwell. He solves really hard programming problems. Another major area of innovation for Valve was in artificial intelligence. Although a lot of games promise advanced intelligence, Valve spent months developing proprietary technology that would actually make enemies work together in packs and flocks. Dave Matson, a webmaster at the popular Half-Life fan site halflife.org, remembers when Gabe Newell gave him a demonstration of the game's AI. Gabe showed me this map that only contained 4 Hound Eye enemies, he remembers. One of them quickly assumed the role as leader and stood on his lone hind legs and watched our every move, looking for signs of aggression. The other 3 creatures cautiously began exploring their surroundings, sniffing the floor and licking bloodstains. It was incredible. Together, the characters, story, AI, and skeletal animation system served as a toolbox that Valve could use in creating the Half-Life game experience, and the group pulled it off beautifully. As game designer Warren Spector, who worked on the Ultima Underworld team, puts it, the most impressive thing Valve has done is make you feel like you're in a real place. This isn't some goofy game space, but a believable research center. Spector does have one minor complaint. Half-Life is still set in a warehouse world, he says. I gave Gabe a hard time about this one. The archetypal game world is filled with nothing but crates. But crates aside, nothing else about Half-Life is archetypal. In particular, Half-Life engages the user's intellect in a way never before seen in the first-person genre. In Quake, explains Newell, the monsters didn't force you to make a lot of decisions. You never had to say to yourself, do I go after these little things first or the bigger thing? There wasn't a lot of that kind of stuff. Next up were the levels, which were designed using an open-ended, collaborative process. We'd generate a general outline for a certain level, explains Laidlaw, then the level designers would go out and generate the architecture, and we'd come back together and see how we could add interactivity to the environment and bring it to life. The levels were designed against a continuous musical backdrop, everything from Mozart to Marilyn Manson. As for the rest of the design process, Valve pretty much made it up as it went. What was really exciting about this project was what was really scary, details Laidlaw. We didn't have a model. It's a great challenge. You have to refer to what worked in the process of creation as a reference point for how to build the game. It was an arduous road with many unexpected twists. As Laidlaw puts it, our model really evolved over time. Yes, it did. As anyone who saw the first screenshots of Half-Life when it was announced to the public in mid-1997 will surely attest. We did a lot of growing up in the public, admits Gabe Newell. When Valve and Sierra jointly announced the game last year, they released 2 screenshots that bear little resemblance to the images in the final game, and that's a good thing. The screenshots we put out when we announced the game were terrible, concedes Newell. Time passed and the images got better. At the 1997 Electronic Entertainment Expo, Valve had a tremendous showing, demonstrating its high-end AI and Birdwell skeletal animation system. We had pretty interesting technology to show what we were doing with the Quake engine, says Newell, but we didn't have the game yet. That didn't stop the press or buyers from christening Half-Life as the next big thing. Rumors had the number of pre-orders for Half-Life in the hundreds of thousands of units after the game was shown at E3. It was even voted as a best game at the show, despite the fact that there wasn't really much of a game on display. The reaction was misguided, but understandable. Awash in a sea of Quake clones, the media was so excited to see original thinking in the genre, it wanted to support the product as much as it could. Not everyone was so optimistic. John Carmack at id Software remembers that he was still very skeptical about Half-Life. For whatever reasons, Half-Life was the license we paid the least attention to during development. The early showings and screenshots never really got us very excited. Energized by its success at the show, the team pushed forward with development in hopes of getting Half-Life ready for the holiday season. As Scott Lynch remembers at Sierra Studios, the big competition last year was Quake 2, and there was a lot of push to get our name out there to go head-to-head with it. It wasn't to be. By August of 1997, Valve recognized that finishing the game for the holidays would mean making major compromises on the product. We realized that to make Christmas, we would have to give up a bunch of stuff we wanted to do, explains Newell. We had to make a decision about what way we wanted to go, and it was a scary decision. We're a self-funded company, so when we pay people's salaries, I write a check out of my personal checking account. Money wasn't the only concern. The relationship with Sierra Studios was also conceivably at risk. Half-Life was supposed to be its biggest game of the year, but it wasn't going to be ready. The massive wheels of promotion and PR had already started to turn, and now the company had to put the brakes on. It seemed like a disaster. Actually, it was the best thing that could have happened. With the holiday pressure off, Valve could spend time evaluating its progress, painfully reviewing every aspect of the game. In essence, the work on Half-Life was weighed in the balance, and it was found wanting. Near the end of 1997, privately and behind closed doors, Valve decided that most of its work, including the work on levels and AI, would be completely scrapped. It just wasn't working.